Well, we're going to pick up where we left off last week. So go ahead and turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis, chapter 47. In just a second, we're going to be reading verses 13 through 14. But let me just kind of give you a little bit of background information. At this point in the story, the focus shifts back to the famine and how Joseph saved the nation of Egypt from starvation. Now, the reason this section is so important is because it explains in a very simplistic way what Joseph did during a time of national crisis. And the policies he instituted and the steps that he took provide an example of how government should respond in times of economic hardship. Now, having said that, let me point out a very important detail. This section is very short. It goes from verse number 13 to verse number 26, and there aren't many details given, just the basics of what Joseph did. And does anyone know why it's so short? Well, the reason it's so short is because it's only meant to give us basic fundamental principles to base our government politics on, or policies on, not politics, policies. Now, the principles that are given still apply today. And if a nation violates these principles, it will have devastating consequences on that nation. And people, that includes America. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. When I was going through the book of Genesis and trying to look to see where I would be in the future, I wanted to make sure that I got to this point or this part after the election. And I have to be honest with you, during my prayer time as we were going towards the election, I felt like the Holy Spirit told me that Romney would lose. And I want you to understand something. America has passed the tipping point. We're not going back, but it's exciting. And the reason it's exciting is because Christians are going to have to be the salt and the light. We are the generation that gets to see the return of Jesus Christ. Now, let me be honest with you. Things are going to get bad. But God will always be God. His word will always work. And He will take care of us if we apply the word of God. So we don't have to be devastated. We don't have to be depressed. But I do want you to understand that there are certain economic and government policies that if they're violated, then that nation becomes cursed. And they bring the curse upon themselves. It's not because God curses them, it's that we bring the curse upon ourselves. Now, having said that, let's go through this section, and I hope that you'll keep an open mind. Let's read verses 13 and 14. Meanwhile, the famine became so severe that all the food was used up, and people were starving throughout the lands of Egypt and Canaan by selling grain to the people. Joseph eventually collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan, and he put the money in Pharaoh's treasury. Now, I want you to notice that when the people ran out of food, the government did not give them food. It sowed them food. Now, let me give you a little bit of background information before I explain why this is so important. If you remember, during the 7-year period before the famine, the 7 years of prosperity, Joseph collected 1/5 of all the crops they harvested in preparation for the famine. In essence, he imposed a 20% tax on all the people. So the government took 20% and the people kept 80%. Look back at Genesis chapter 41, verses 34 through 36. Notice what it says. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5, in other words, 20%, of all the crops during the 7 good years, the years of prosperity. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away. Guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine comes to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Now, here's what's interesting. The people were allowed to keep 80% of what they harvested, but they ran out of food shortly after the famine started. If you remember, the people started buying grain from Egypt during the first year of the famine. We know that because Joseph's brothers came to buy grain almost a year before Joseph revealed himself to them. And we know that he revealed himself to them during the 2nd year of the famine. It's the details, people. Look what it says in Genesis chapter 45. We're looking backwards, verses 5 through 6. He tells his brothers, but don't be upset, don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years. So now that he's revealed himself in the second year of the famine. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting during that time period. So that tells us that the people started running out of food or grain shortly after the famine started. In other words, in the beginning of the first year. Now, I want you to think about this. The government taxed the people 20% during the 7 good years, the years of prosperities, and the people were allowed to keep 80%. And yet they ran out of grain shortly after the famine started, which tells us that they were living year to year, or as we would say, paycheck to paycheck. In other words, they were consuming all that they made and they weren't saving anything for the future. So when their grain ran out, there was still 6.5 years of the famine to go. So the government had to feed all of the people for 6.5 years on the 20% that they collected. But the people were used to living on 80%. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. In fact, let me grab a black one. During the 7 years of prosperity, they have to prepare for the 7 years of famine. So let's suppose, and I'm going to make it very simple, so we're going to use small numbers, just add zeros to the end of that. Is that all right? Let's suppose that a person's land produced 1,000 bushels of wheat. Well, Joseph comes along and he imposes a 20% tax. He says, we're going to take 20% of what you harvest. And so he would take 200 bushels, and that allowed them to keep 800 bushels. And they did that for 7 years. So after 7 years' time, people had produced, if we just continue to go through here and write these down, here's 4, 5, 6, 7. That means that their land produced how many bushels during that time of prosperity? 7,000. So there's 7,000 bushels. How much would the government take? How much did Joseph take? 20%, which would be how many? That's 200 times 7. 1,400 bushels is how much they collected. But here's what's interesting. If you do this 800 bushels that they got to keep for 7 years, what does that make? 5,600 bushels. Now this is what's interesting. They were used to living on 800 bushels because they lived from year to year. You only collected in the whole 7-year period 1,400 bushels. Within almost a year and 3/4, that's 1,600. You have only collected enough for what they're used to consuming in about a year and a half to a year and 3/4. Wow. So how was the government supposed to make the 20% they collected last for 6.5 years? How were they going to feed all of their people and at the same time make the grain last for 6.5 years? Because after this 7 years of prosperity, there's going to be how many years of famine? 7 years. Now, if you want to get technical, it has to last for 7.5 years, not 6.5, because they wouldn't be able to reap a harvest until a year after the last famine. Does that make sense? So how did Joseph make the 20% he collected during the 7 good years last for 7.5 years with a nation that was used to consuming 4 times that much? 80%. Think about that. They were used to consuming 4 times what they were collecting and storing for the famine. Well, the first thing that Joseph did was he made the people pay for the grain they received. He did not give the grain to them. He made them take from their savings to pay for it, because Joseph knew that when the people saw their savings dwindling, they wouldn't waste the grain. Listen to me. It's human nature to waste when times are good. But when times are bad and we have to start taking out of our savings to buy necessities, we become very frugal. You see, Joseph understood human nature. He knew that if he gave the people food, they would continue to waste it. But if he made them pay for it, they would be frugal with it. They would come along and say, you know what, we're used to living on 800 bushels. We live from year to year. but we're going to have to make it on 200 bushels a year. And they wouldn't want to do that unless they saw their savings dwindling. And they're starting to look in the future and go, whoa, we've got to cut back. We can't waste. So he started out, Joseph did, by making the people buy the grain out of their savings. In other words, no free lunch. Let me say that again. Governments need to learn this. No free lunch. Again, Joseph understood human nature. He understood that if he wasn't careful, the famine would create an entitlement mentality, especially if the government gave the people food. Joseph knew that if the government did that, people would come to expect the government to take care of them during difficult times. So he made the people pay for what they received. And when they couldn't pay for what they received, then he made them barter for what they received. Which brings us to verses 15 through 17. Notice what it says. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all of the Egyptians came to Joseph. Our money is gone, they cried, but please give us food or we will die before your very eyes. Joseph replied, since your money is gone, bring me your livestock. I will give you food in exchange for your livestock. So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food. In exchange for their horses, flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and donkeys, Joseph provided them with food for another year. Now, I want you to notice that when their money was gone, the people wanted the government to give them food. Did you notice that? Look at verse number 15 again. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all the Egyptians came to Joseph. Our money is gone, they cried, but please give us food. Because if you don't, we're going to die before your very eyes. But here's what's interesting. Joseph refused to give it away. Instead of giving them food, he made them barter for it. Now, people, this is the equivalent of selling their valuables or selling their assets. Remember, the majority of flocks and herds had to be kept in the land of Goshen because they didn't have enough farmland. So therefore, they had shepherds taking care of that if they were rich. If they weren't rich, they would still have livestock, they would have animals, but they didn't have large herds of it. So what they began to do is they started selling their assets, they started selling their valuables, anything that they could get. But here's the interesting thing, money failed. So there was no one to buy their assets, there was no one to buy their valuables, there was no one to buy their livestock. So they started trading that to the government for food. Now again, Joseph knew that if he gave it away, the people wouldn't be frugal with it. Instead, they would waste it, and it wouldn't be long before the grain was all gone. Remember, the 20% they collected during those 7 good years had to feed the people for 7 years of famine, and until they were able to sow and reap a harvest that year after. And to do that, they couldn't waste any of it at all. Now, do you want to know why America has a $16 trillion deficit? Oh, because we've had 2 wars. Well, that might be a little part of it, but that's not the major part of it. It's because, people, we waste money. We have programs that duplicate themselves. We give money away. And because our government gives things to people, we don't make people pay for it or earn it. Therefore, they waste it too. That's just the way it is. Joseph understood that. Now, it didn't take long before they had traded all of their assets for grain, for food. So now they had nothing left to trade for food. What are they going to do? Which brings us to verses 18 and 19. Notice what it says. But that year ended. And the next year they came again and said, we cannot hide the truth from you, my Lord. Our money is gone and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate. Now, verse number 18 begins with, but that year ended. Does anyone know which year that's referring to? Anyone? That's referring to the 3rd year. You see, they started buying grain sometime during the 1st year of the famine. But by the end of the second year, their money had run out. So by the third year, they were trading anything they could to get food. But by the end of the third year, their money and all of their assets were gone. So notice what they said. Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Now I want you to notice what Joseph's policies had done for the people. Look at verses 18 and 19 again, and I want you to see their mentality. But that year ended, and the next year they came again and said, we cannot hide the truth from you, my Lord. Our money's gone, and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate. Now, people, do you see that? By the fourth year of the famine, the people no longer had an entitlement mentality. It was gone. They no longer expected the government to give them food. They expected to either pay for it or earn it. Now, people, that's impressive, but that's the result of Joseph's wise policies. The only way that their government could come out of this strong and it would help and benefit the people is to teach the people that it's the right thing to do to work. You've got to get rid of that entitlement mentality, and you've got to have a work mentality. Now, listen to me. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Good government policies create a work mentality. Good government policies create a work mentality. Bad government policies create an entitlement mentality. Bad government policies create an entitlement mentality. People, we've got to create an incentive to work. If you want the nation to be strong, you need a very hard-working people. You've got to do that. Now, look at verse number 19 again. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate. Now, most people don't understand what the people were asking for. In fact, I would dare say that the majority of you have read the book of Genesis over and over again. You've read the story of Joseph. You've read this hundreds of times, but you really don't understand what they were asking for. What they were asking for was to become indentured servants to the government in exchange for food. Now, does everyone know what an indentured servant is? If you're taking notes, write this down. An indentured servant was someone who agreed to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. Now, if you remember, in the 1700s and the 1800s, when America was being settled, a lot of people who wanted to come to America couldn't afford to come to America, so what did they do? They became indentured servants. They agreed to work for someone for 7 years when they got to America in exchange for the ticket to get here. So what they did was they came over here, the other person bought their ticket, and they were an indentured servant. They helped them build their home, they helped them clear their land, they helped them to be able to build their farm up. And at the end of 7 years, it was normally 7 years, it could be longer, it could be shorter, but at the end of 7 years, they were given a stake. And the reason they were given a stake is because that's what the Bible teaches. If you remember when we talked about Jacob and Laban, the Bible teaches that when you have an indentured servant, because they've helped you to build your wealth, when they leave, you don't let them leave empty-handed. So what you would do is you would give them a stake. You would give them so much cattle. You would give them a little bit of money. You would give them what they needed to be able to build their place. That's what an indentured servant was. So what the Egyptian people wanted was to work for the government for a set period of time in exchange for food. And because they were farmers, they were offering to work their land when the famine was over. And I'm going to prove that to you in just a minute. And they were wanting to give a percentage of it, what they harvested, to Pharaoh for a certain amount of time in exchange for food. That's what they meant when they said, buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. They were wanting to become indentured servants to the government in exchange for food. Now listen to me, because this is very important. They did not want to become permanent slaves. That's not what they were saying they wanted. They weren't asking for that. They wanted to be indentured servants, which meant that they would only be Pharaoh's servants for a set period of time. Now, if you don't understand the culture at that time, you don't realize what they were asking for, so you don't understand what Joseph was agreeing to. So when you read that story, it's almost like Joseph was taking advantage of them. It's almost like Joseph was taking everything they had. He was making the government rich on the backs of the hardworking people. People, that wasn't that way at all. He had to get through 7 years of famine and allow them to be able to reap when the floods finally did come, to bring in all that topsoil and all of that water, to be able to plant their seeds and reap the harvest the year after the 7-year famine. He had to get through on 20%, and they were used to living on 4 times that much. So by the time they get here, let me tell you something. They kiss his feet. And the only reason the Hebrews become slaves shortly after is because a Pharaoh came along who didn't remember, who didn't know Joseph, and didn't know what a wonderful thing he did to save the nation or the people. The people kissed his feet for what he did. He did not take advantage of the people, but the reason we think that is because we don't know what they were asking for. We think they were asking to be permanent slaves, and they weren't doing that. They were asking to become indentured servants. So when they asked to become indentured servants in exchange for food, Joseph had to negotiate a contract with them. And here's what they needed to agree upon. If you're taking notes, write this down. Number 1, what type of work would they do while the famine was going on in exchange for food? In other words, they were farmers. And the reason there was a famine is because there was a drought going on. There wasn't the floods that always came that would bring the topsoil in, covering the lands, leave all this rich topsoil. You had plenty of water. So they couldn't even sow. So they couldn't actually work for the Pharaoh in what they normally did, because the famine was caused by this drought. So what they had to do was they had to determine what kind of work they could do while the famine was going on. He wasn't just going to let them sit around and say, well, you know, when the famine's over, then we're going to pay you back. No. Number 2, how much would they have to give to Pharaoh when the famine was over and they started farming their land again? Remember, they're offering to make their land, not just themselves, a servant of Pharaoh. Let me say that again, because that is a detail that most people miss as they read the story. They're offering to make their land, not just themselves, a servant of Pharaoh. Look at verse number 19 again. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves. Now, in the original Hebrew, the way this is grammatically, it's saying we're offering our land as slaves for Pharaoh and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. And that's how we know technically they weren't saying, let us be permanent slaves. They weren't wanting that. They were wanting to become indentured servants. And the third thing they had to agree on was the length of time they were willing to work for Pharaoh in exchange for food. Because remember, an indentured servant is someone who has agreed to become a servant for someone, has agreed to do a certain amount of work, a certain type of work for a set period of time in exchange for something. So the third thing they had to agree on was the length of time that they were willing to work for Pharaoh in exchange for the food that he was going to give them during this last part of the famine. Now, verses 20 through 26 explains the contract or the agreement that Joseph made with them. So let's go through this section verse by verse. I want to show you some really interesting things, starting with verse number 20. It says, so Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold him their fields because the famine was so severe. And soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. Now, that gives us the wrong impression. And the reason it does is because when we think of the word bought, we think, well, it's now yours. You own that land. But let's go back to the original Hebrew. The word bought in this verse is translated from the Hebrew word kana, and in this context, it means to acquire the right to something. Let me say that again. To acquire the right to something. So Pharaoh acquired the right to a percentage of their harvest when they started farming again in exchange for giving them food. Let me say that again. So Pharaoh acquired the right to a percentage of their harvest when they started farming again in exchange for giving them food. Now, some of the people held out because they didn't want to become an indentured servant to the Pharaoh. They didn't want to have to give a percentage of their harvest when the famine was over and they started farming again. They didn't want to have to give a percentage to Pharaoh. So they tried to hold out. But this verse tells us that the famine was so severe that eventually everyone had to do it. Look at the last part of verse 20. So Joseph bought. In other words, he acquired the right. Some of you guys, because you're farmers, or even some of you are deer hunters, how many of you lease someone else's land? This is what this word is really talking about. You've acquired the right. You bought the lease on it. So here we are in verse number 20. It's so severe, and you have people say, you know what, when this famine is over, I don't want to have to give a percentage, but they couldn't hold out. Look at verse 20. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold him their fields because the famine was so severe. And soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. And of course, we find out there's one exception, the priest. They were the only ones that were given food, but it's because they continued on doing their services for the government. They were being paid for what they were doing. Therefore, they did not have to sell their land, but that was the only exception. Now, again, remember, there's a difference between being a slave and indentured servant. A slave was the permanent property of someone. An indentured servant, on the other hand, was someone who agreed to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. So the Egyptian people agreed to work for Pharaoh during the famine in exchange for food, and they agreed to work their land for Pharaoh after the famine. So I want you to see what they're doing. They agreed to work for Pharaoh during the famine, but they're farmers. What are they going to do? We're going to find out in a little bit. But they also agreed that when the famine was over, they would work for Pharaoh. So now there's only two things left that they need to agree upon in order to have this contract. What percentage of the harvest would the Pharaoh get when they started farming again, and for how long? Those were the two other things that needed to be agreed upon in order for this contract to be sealed, for the people to become an indentured servant unto Pharaoh. How much is Pharaoh going to get? What percentage of our crops? And for how long will he get it? So let's see what they agreed upon concerning those two things. First, how much would Pharaoh get when the famine was over and the people went back to farming? In other words, what percentage of the harvest? Well, look at verses 23 and 24. Then Joseph said to the people, look, today I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh. In other words, we've come to an agreement. Here's the contract. I will provide you with seed so you can plant the fields. It's talking about future, right? Because they're in the fourth year of the famine. They've got 4, 5, 6, 7. 4 more years of this. But it's going to be over. God told Joseph after 7 years. And when the famine's over, here's what's going to do. He's agreed to do. I will provide you with seed so you can plant the fields. That's a one-time proposition. Then when you harvest it, 1/5 of your crop will belong to Pharaoh. You may keep the remaining 4/5 as seed for your fields and as food for you, your households, and your little ones. So we're going to go back to what it was when we were preparing for this famine. Pharaoh will get 20%. And that's what the agreement is. Pharaoh's going to get 20% of what they harvested. But for how long? Well, in verse number 26, we find out it was indefinitely. In other words, it didn't end. Look at verse 26. Joseph then issued a decree, still in effect in the land of Egypt, that Pharaoh should receive 1/5 of all the crops grown in his land. Only the land belonging to the priest was not given to Pharaoh. Now, do you see that? The decree that Pharaoh would get 20% of what they harvested was still in effect when Moses wrote Genesis. Who wrote Genesis? Moses did. Moses said the decree that Joseph gave that Pharaoh would get 20%, he said, is still in effect. In other words, the person who's writing Genesis is saying, that happened way back then, but it's still in effect today, in my time. And Moses is the one who wrote that. In other words, almost 400 years later. So in exchange for food, they agreed to pay 20% tax on their harvest. So from then on, once the famine is over, they would always pay 20% to the Pharaoh, which was a great deal because the amount of taxes levied was often left to the discretion of the ruler. You can go back, and there's only a certain period of time, which we believe is when Joseph was there. But we can go back and we can look at certain things that we found, archaeologists have found, and sometimes the tax was 25%, sometimes it was 35%, sometimes it was 50%. In fact, the Babylonians were the worst. They would do 50%. Now, this permanently fixed taxes at 20%. People, that's why the people were so grateful to Joseph. Because before the famine ever started, there were times when they had to pay 20% and 25%. You remember when Joseph said this? He said, you need to tell the people that we're going to take 20% because we have to prepare for this. And so here's what rulers would do many times. They would tax the people as much as they could without having a revolt. And when the people got fed up, then they would loosen it up and lighten the load a little bit, and they would let that go along, and then they would slowly start raising it again. So when Joseph said we need to take 20% in the good years to prepare for the bad years, here's what's interesting. The people didn't say anything because they thought, here it goes again. It's going to slowly start going up. But here they negotiate this contract, and Joseph comes out and he says, here's what we're going to do. From now on, indefinitely, Pharaoh will take 20%. And the people are ecstatic because what he's saying is, we're going to fix taxes permanently at 20%. Look at verse number 25. You have saved our lives, exclaimed the people. May it please you, my Lord, to let us be Pharaoh's servants. In other words, we won't forget you. This is wonderful. What you're basically telling us is, when we go back to work, we just have to pay regular taxes. Wow. People, Joseph did not take advantage of the people. That's why he was so well loved. Now, let me make an important point. The Bible advocates, and Joseph set up, a fair tax system. In other words, everyone paid the same percentage in taxes. If you were rich and you owned a lot of land, you paid 20% of everything that you harvested off of your land. If you were poor and you owned a little bit of land, you paid 20% of everything you harvested after the famine. Rich or poor, you actually paid the very same percentage. And it's the same way with the tithe. As you go through the Bible, you know what's interesting? How much do rich people owe in tithes? 10%. How many of you know what the word tithe means? Anyone? Tithe actually means a tenth. You owe a tenth. If you're a rich person, you owe a tithe. You owe a tenth of what you earn, what comes in. If you're a poor person, how much do you owe God? A tenth. A tithe. 10%. Rich or poor, you're supposed to pay the very same percentage, 10%. Now, the rich will pay more tithes because they make more money. The poor will pay less tithes because they make less money. But they both pay the same percentage. Listen to me. Don't buy into the liberal philosophy that the rich need to pay a higher percentage rate and call it their fair share. People, that's not biblical. That's not biblical at all. Everyone needs to pay the same percentage in taxes according to the Bible. Why? Why? Because that provides the right incentive to work. If you don't want to work that hard, no big deal. You work to what you get, and you're going to pay the same amount of taxes. You want to work really hard? Well, you don't have to go, I can't make any more than this because that puts me in a different tax bracket. Let me tell you, we kill our economy when we do that. Now, what we normally want to do is we want to create this class warfare, but people, that's not biblical. Now, let me go backwards for a second, because we didn't talk about what the people did during the famine. Remember, midway through the first year of the famine, they ran out of grain because they were living year to year. So what did they do? They started taking from their savings and buying grain. And by the end of the second year, they're out of money. So the third year, what do? They start selling all their livestock. They start selling off their assets, any of the valuables that they have. I can't say they started selling them off. They started trading them or giving them to the government in exchange for food. But by the end of the third year, that's all gone. So the fourth year, they come and they make this contract with Joseph. After the famine, this is what we'll do. But what about during the famine? Remember, over 95% of the people were farmers, but they couldn't farm as long as the drought was on. In fact, if you remember when we were reading, it said, and neither will they sow or reap. Why? Because you didn't actually sow until after the floods came, and then it went down, and you had all of this great topsoil. Egypt means black dirt. The Nile needed the flood, and that provided all of that farmland. And when that didn't happen, they didn't sow. So, if 95% of the people are farmers, but they couldn't farm as long as the drought was on, did Joseph allow them to just sit around and draw food stamps? Let's make this real. Did Joseph allow them to sit around and just draw food stamps? No. Look back at verse number 21. We jumped ahead because we were looking at this contract, but now we're going to jump back and see what else was part of this contract. Look at verse 21. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt, even to the other ends thereof. In other words, since they couldn't farm as long as there was a drought, Joseph moved all of the farmers to certain cities throughout Egypt. Does anyone know why? Two reasons. First of all, that's where the grain was stored. If you remember, Joseph had the grain stored in different cities throughout Egypt. Genesis chapter 41, verse number 48 says, during those years, what years? The 7 good years when they were collecting 20% of everything that was harvested. During those years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from surrounding fields in the cities. So they were moved, or the people were moved to where the grain was. The second reason they were moved to the cities was because that's where the work was. You see, the work they were required to do in exchange for food was construction. So during the famine, the people worked on public projects, much like the WPA program that was during the Depression. You took these people, you went in, we built these things that these cities needed. For a while, our church was located in an old National Guard armory. That's a WPA building. In fact, I can't tell you the number of people when we bought it and we were remodeling, how many old-timers would come in. And they would say, my dad cut the stone for this building. And they would say, around Woodall. And then they would start telling me how they did it. And then they would look at this uneven floor and they would say, do you realize that they made the concrete right here at the town branch? And they were bringing it in wheelbarrows. There weren't any trucks to do that. And these old timers were telling these great stories. But it's because they had WPA programs. And let me tell you where that came from was Joseph. And he took these people from the farm and he said, you guys are farmers, but we can't sow. We can't plow. We're not going to be able to reap for another 4 years. We're not going to sit around and get food stamps because if you're not doing anything, what do you want to do when you're sitting around? You want to eat. We only have 20%, and you're used to eating 40 or 80%, 4 times as much. We're going to work you hard. And he did that. Now, once again, we're seeing that Joseph made them work for food. It was not given to them. And by the time the famine was over, listen to me, Egypt became the most powerful empire in the world. Joseph transformed that nation. And many of the public works projects that you can go and see today if you travel to Egypt were built during that period. Were the pyramids? No. They were already there. When Abraham came to Egypt, pyramids were there. But many of the public projects that these cities needed that made them the jewel of the world happened because of what Joseph did. Now listen to me. If a nation wants to prosper, they follow the same policies that Joseph instituted. If you don't institute policies that do those things, then we won't prosper. It's as simple as that. Now, I find it very interesting that as I'm studying the prophecies concerning the return of Jesus Christ, nowhere are there any prophecies that even look like they refer to this country known as America. Now, let me ask you a question. How in the world would a superpower not be mentioned in something as great as the end time, the return of Jesus? It would be. But I can tell you why it's not going to be mentioned. Because we are heading down the wrong path. And to be honest with you, there's nothing we can do about it. That's what's going to happen. But the reason I tell you this is because as Christians, we need to be prepared. And we need to understand what's taking place. And we need to teach our children a strong work ethic, even though our culture is not going to develop that.